Conditions may apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 90. Getting Back in Touch. Toshi! Naomasa exclaimed at a volume just barely acceptable for the cafe they were meeting in. Naomasa! Toshinori greeted in return with a smile so wide it made Naomasa wonder how no one had put two and two together and realized he was All Might years ago. He didn't hesitate to hug the giant twig of a man when he got up and offered his hand out for a handshake. He felt more than he heard the small laugh he let out in response as Toshinori quickly hugged him back. I'm sorry it's been so long, my friend. I guess I don't really have an excuse, he said when they pulled apart, the smile no longer brightening his gaunt face. I understand, Toshinori. Things get busy. Life happens. I could have reached out too. It's not like I didn't know you were back in town. His attempt to assuage his concerns earned him a small smile, but he could tell that Toshinori was not convinced that he wasn't the one to blame, which didn't surprise him. Old habits die hard. So what brings you back in town anyway? He asked as he took his seat across from Toshinori at the booth he had saved for them in the corner of the cafe. Toshinori smiled sadly again. He was surprised that his lexicon of Toshinori's fake smiles had not been lost to time. It had been over 4 years since he had last seen the man. The steaming mug of coffee that was waiting for him on his side of the table told him that his own idiosyncrasies hadn't been forgotten either. You know I'm getting old, Naomasa, he answered. You're middle-aged, he argued back. Toshinori laughed ruefully at his response. I appreciate your optimism. Silence hung between them for a beat after that. He knew Toshinori's health wasn't the best ever since. Well, he preferred not to dwell on that. Are you getting worse? He asked hesitantly. To his surprise, he genuinely smiled back in response. Not without good reason, Toshinori replied. Naomasa felt his jaw drop in shock. He looked around to make sure no one was within earshot, but Toshinori had picked a suitably secluded booth. You found a successor? Have you already? He trailed off. Toshinori nodded, and his grin grew back to the same blinding brilliance it held when Naomasa first walked in. He had a million questions, and he didn't know where to start. He wanted to hear all about them, whoever it was that his friend had chosen, but ultimately he was more concerned about what this meant for Toshinori. Wait, so you're getting worse? He asked and regretted immediately as the smile fell from his friend's face. Yes, that's how aging works, unfortunately. I'm not about to drop dead if that's what you're worried about. I've still got some time, he replied, not unkindly. How much? I haven't gotten an expiration date. I'll let you know if that changes, he joked before taking a sip of his tea. Toshi, this isn't funny, he chastised, rubbing at his tired eyes with his thumb and forefinger. No, I suppose it's not, he agreed with another sad smile. I don't know, Naomasa. Could be years. Maybe you're right. Maybe I am middle-aged. I've got just as much certainty about my longevity as anyone else. Silence fell across the table once more, and he took a sip of his coffee. It was just the way he liked it. Let's talk about something less dour. How have you been doing? Toshinori asked after a moment. Good. I've been good. I got promoted to detective a few years back, and I think I'm looking toward another promotion pretty soon, though that's not entirely based on my own merit, but you won't hear me complaining. The chief detective at the precinct is retiring in a few months, and I look like I've been doing far more work than I actually have been on paper because of a vigilante who's been running around doing all the grunt work. Of course, you didn't hear that from me, though, he said, recapping the last 4 years as succinctly as possible. Of course, Toshinori agreed with mock sincerity. No vigilantes around here. What about you? Tell me about your shining young pupil. Toshinori's smile returned before he even got the sentence out. Oh, he's wonderful, he said with a shimmer of pride in his eye. I've had him cleaning up Dagobah for the past 8 months now. Oh, yeah. I passed by there last month and I thought it was looking much cleaner than I'd remembered. You're telling me one person did all that? You've been helping, right? Minimally. Anything smaller than a car was all him. It's good strength training, and he's been taking it very seriously. I couldn't ask for more dedication. Strength training, he mused aloud. Yeah, I'd imagine that'd do the trick. You said you already. He trailed off, not wanting to say too much on the off chance someone was listening. Yes, last month, he confirmed, understanding Naomasa's non-question. It went, disastrously, but we're getting there, slowly. Disastrously? He pushed him to elaborate. It's quite difficult to control, and, well, I'm not so sure I'm the best teacher, he said with a nervous laugh as he rubbed at the nape of his neck. He accidentally, went full throttle and destroyed his arm the first time he tried to use it. Thankfully, I was there. I took him to the hospital and he had to get surgery to set the bones in his hand. They were completely shattered. Naomasa didn't even try to suppress his cringe. That sounded awful. He could see the guilt written on Toshinori's features, so he tried to steer the topic elsewhere. How did you meet him? His look of guilt only deepened. I'm afraid that went rather disastrously, too. Well, how about something non-disastrous? Naomasa interrupted. Just tell me about him. What makes him so wonderful? His name is Midoriya. He started, a smile already creeping back onto his features. He is just so talented. Everything I ask of him, he does with astounding competence. He's been sorting through everything to recycle, you know? I didn't even ask him to. I bet you less than half of the stuff on that beach is going to end up in a landfill by the time he's done. He's just so good. It's not even a conscious effort on his part. He saw a crab one day, and ever since then, he checks where he's throwing something before he throws it, just in case there's another one. I've never met someone just so fundamentally good. Toshinori explained with a grin, as if he himself hadn't been carrying around a pocket full of change to feed into parking meters that were running low since before Naomasa had even met him. Like he didn't have coffee waiting for his friend he hadn't seen in 4 years, made to his exact preference. Naomasa couldn't help but smile back at the irony. And he's smart, too. Always coming up with creative solutions rather than giving up and asking me for help. He moved this industrial-sized refrigerator once with wheels and axles he fastened together with scraps. The thing must have weighed 600 pounds, but he moved it on his own. He's been studying quirks and heroes for a decade, too. He's got these analysis journals. I haven't seen much of them, but what I have seen is absolutely brilliant. He notes their fighting styles and incorporates them into his own martial arts training, which he's been doing for a few years. The first time we sparred, he knocked the wind out of me. He threw sand in my face and kicked me in the ribs while I had my eyes closed, he said with a full-bellied laugh. Damn, Naomasa was impressed. It seemed like Toshinori had found a real gem. It also seemed like his friend was completely besotted, like a proud dad. He supposed that probably wasn't too far from the truth. How old is he? He asked, genuinely curious. He's only 14, he exclaimed. Well, 15 now. He's on the fast track to greatness. Entrance exams are in less than 2 months, and he's going to get into UA. I'm sure of it. Naomasa was slightly concerned about that. 15 was young. One might argue too young, but Toshinori wasn't any older than that when he received One for All. He'd at least had it before UA. That much was public record. Naomasa wasn't sure when or how his friend had received One for All. He knew he'd been young, and there had been exacerbating circumstances, But Toshinori didn't like to talk much about the past. The power had always been a burden to bear, hopefully less so now that all for one was no longer an issue to be factored into the equation. 15, he repeated, his contemplative silence no doubt having become concerning. Toshinori nodded in response. Is he handling this all well? Oh, he's rather nervous about everything. He could definitely use some confidence, but we're working on it, he responded. He's just a kid, Toshi, he warned. I know. All right, just make sure you don't forget that. Huh. It's hard to forget when he's 5 foot nothing, he quipped good-naturedly. Well, not really. He's a bit taller than that, but not by much, he said as he started tapping at his phone screen. Naomasa gave him a minute and was rewarded with a picture of a green-haired kid sitting on a stack of tires, presumably at Dagobah, while smiling shyly with a Tupperware of soup in his lap and a spoon halfway to his mouth. He made us the stew. He grew the tomatoes himself, he added brightly. Toshinori proceeded to show him about a dozen more pictures of the kid and himself spanning over the past few months, if the changes in seasons around them was anything to go by. He had been worried about him since the moment he stepped into the cafe. Naomasa would never say it, but he looked awful. He looked like a particularly strong breeze could blow him over, but at the same time, he'd never seen him so happy. He'd known the man for over a decade now, and he'd never seen him smile like that, like he wasn't holding the weight of the world on his shoulders. He hoped dearly that he hadn't settled that weight onto his successor. Time was slipping through his fingers, and Izuku had never been so stressed in his life. 2 months went by in the blink of an eye, and the beach was absolutely spotless. He had finished it a few weeks ago, and people were starting to come back to enjoy the views, which was bittersweet. He felt like he was losing a place that was supposed to be his, but at the same time, this was what he'd been working toward. The beach would always be there. He just needed to share it now. It was still pretty well deserted in the early mornings, and All Might had been making good on Gran Torino's promise. He wasn't going easy on him anymore. He spent 45 minutes of his 3-hour limit working with Izuku every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday, and Izuku liked to think it was paying off. Using One for All was becoming more instinctual, which was good, but he was worried it was going to become a problem on patrols. It hadn't yet. The mental dissonance between him and his Ivy persona had been enough to keep it at bay, but he couldn't help but worry regardless. He knew he needed to figure out a way to end his extracurriculars soon, but he could hardly bear the thought of it. Uptown was his home, and his people needed him. They needed Ivy. How could he just leave them? What was he supposed to do? Just pack up and move on to greener pastures? What about Eraser? He wouldn't just give up on them if they left, and he couldn't risk the possibility of him poking around and finding out who he really was. More than any of that, though, was the plain truth that he needed Ivy. He needed to be Ivy for him. Being Ivy, ironic as it was, given how much danger it put him in, saved his life. He owed everything to them, as weird as it was, and as little sense as it made. He didn't want to let them down. He had a feeling that letting someone down was going to be unavoidable. He made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. He still had time, though. Less and less by the day, but there was still time. Just a little more time. Just a little more time. End of chapter.